Hi everyone, today I am going to be sharing my process for making sourdough bread. Making sourdough can be a little bit intimidating and the process may seem really complicated, but it really doesn't have to be. I wanted to come up with a way where there was no measuring, no weighing out your flour and water. You don't have to worry about hydration percentages, and the whole thing can be done start to finish within 24 hours. I'm going to show you how everything should look at every stage of the process, and that way when you get a general feel of it, you never have to rely on specific numbers, and you can kind of just adapt this process to whatever flour you're using, whatever season you're baking in, and also your own timeline. So that's the process I'm going to be showing you today. Let's jump to the very beginning and probably the most important part of sourdough, which is your starter. The quality of your sourdough will link directly to the quality of your starter, so you want to start with a very active and robust starter. I keep my starter in the fridge usually until I'm ready to bake, and then 2 days before I'll take it out of the fridge and give it a few feedings. I space those feedings 12 to 24 hours apart, and you'll know your starter is active enough when it doubles in size within 4 to 8 hours. A feeding is basically just giving your starter fresh flour and water just like I'm doing here. This is about the amount that I like to start with, which is a little less than what a lot of people start with, but I find that this works well for me. I don't have to continually discard a lot of starter whenever I want to make sourdough, and it's very manageable to keep in this size jar as well. To my starter, I'm adding a couple of spoonfuls of all-purpose flour. You can see I'm not measuring here. I'm just eyeballing it and trying to make it so that I am adding as much flour and water as there is starters. Effectively, I'm doubling it in volume, and then I'm just going to add some water until I know that it's a good consistency, and the consistency I like is kind of like muffin batter. I think a lot of people like it a little looser, but I find having it a little bit thicker, it's a little bit easier to work with, and as a few hours pass, it tends to get a little bit more liquidy as well. So I think this is perfect. I'm just gonna put a lid over this, and then I'm going to put a rubber band over the jar and kind of mark where the level of the starter is now so that I can keep track of it and know when it is generally doubled in size. Like I mentioned, if you have an active starter, then it should double in size, ideally within 4 to 6 hours. Sourdough is only 4 ingredients. It's flour, water, salt, and your starter. There's no commercial yeast, so if your starter is not alive, then your bread is not going to rise. So just keep this on your counter at room temperature. For us, that's about 72 degrees. The warmer it is, the faster this is going to rise. So if you have a cold house, try and find the warmest place in your house where you can put this. A few hours in, I can just about start seeing some movement from my starter. It's starting to get a little bit bubbly, and I'm starting to see the volume go up just a little bit. And I know it's going to be doubled in size within an hour or so. And when I know that it's getting close to being doubled in size, I'm going to start the Autolyse process. And this is basically just adding your flour and water before you add your starter and your salt. I usually make 2 loaves of sourdough at a time because you are going through a kind of a long process, and it's just as easy to make 2 loaves as it is to make 1. So you might as well make 2, and then if you can't finish both of them, you can always freeze one of them because it freezes beautifully. I'm starting off with 3 cups of whole wheat bread flour and 3 cups of unbleached white all-purpose flour. I'll talk a little bit more about the flour in just a little bit, but you can see here that I'm just scooping cups of flour from my container, and I'm not really worrying about leveling it off or weighing it out. I know that this is very unconventional because people love to weigh all of their ingredients for sourdough, but I personally just don't find that it's necessary, and it's kind of a barrier to making sourdough. So what I do is I get a general 6 cups of flour. It's okay if it's a little bit off because I'm not measuring the water either. I am kind of just eyeballing that. So for 6 cups of flour, you'll need about 3.5 cups of water, but that can really vary based on your humidity and how much the specific flour you're using absorbs. For example, I know that the whole wheat flour that I use is pretty thirsty, and I know that I actually need to add a little bit more water in order to hydrate that flour properly. So I like to just add water until I see that it's the consistency that I like. And the goal here is to make a shaggy mass of dough. I prefer mine a little bit on the drier side because I find that it's easier to work with, especially later on when you're shaping your loaves. So you'll see there actually is little bits of flour left at the bottom of the bowl, and that's totally okay. This Autolyse process is giving your flour time to hydrate in that water, and as this sits, that flour is going to soak up all of that water, and it's going to look very different from this shaggy mass that we're starting with. Okay, so while I'm mixing this, let me just talk about flour for just a second because this is the main part of your sourdough, and there are so many options for flour out there. You can use whatever flour you have. When I first started making sourdough, I used all-purpose flour for all 6 cups, and the brand I used was King Arthur unbleached all-purpose flour. I found that one worked really well for me because it does have kind of a higher gluten content for an all-purpose flour. And I think that is a great flour to be starting off with. And it is pretty accessible in most grocery stores. I know you can buy it in 12-pound bags, at least at my Costco, which is great because if you start getting into making sourdough, you're going to go through a lot of flour really fast. These days we've switched to organic flour, and the King Arthur one is pretty pricey and you can't get it in bulk. So we've been ordering our flour in bulk from Azure Standard, and both of the flours that I'm using here today are from there, both the whole wheat bread flour and also just a plain unbleached all-purpose flour as well, and they are both organic. I'll leave a link to Azure in the description box down below if you want to check it out, and if you shop through our link, it does help support our channel. So anyway, now I am done mixing up my flour and water. You can see that it is very shaggy. There are bits of flour at the bottom of the bowl, and that's totally okay. We're just gonna leave this on the counter covered for 45 minutes to an hour, and you're gonna see how much this is going to transform just by sitting there. We're not kneading it or anything, and it's just going to completely absorb all of that liquid and become a lot more relaxed looking. It's been an hour since we've done our Autolyse process, and here's a look at our starter. At this point, you can see that it has doubled in size, and another thing that is pretty important is that if you look at it, it's domed up on the top, and that means that it's actively growing, and it means that it hasn't reached its highest point and has started to go down. If you miss it by like a little bit, it's okay, don't worry about it, but this is the ideal way that you want your starter to look. And here's a look at our flour that has been auto-leasing. It looks a lot more relaxed and you don't see any dry bits of flour. Now I'm going to incorporate the salt and the starter into the dough. I'm adding 1 tablespoon of salt per 3 cups of flour. So for me, that's 2 tablespoons of salt since I'm making 2 loaves. And you can see how different the texture of that flour is. It's almost like a little bit stretchy already, even though we haven't kneaded it or anything. And I'm going to add a few large spoonfuls of my starter, the equivalent of maybe like half a cup. I basically just add enough starter so that I have a couple of tablespoons still left in my jar, and then whatever I can spare to put in my dough, that's what I'll do. I just want to leave a little bit of starter so that I can feed it and put it back in my fridge, but you really don't need a lot. I just have a couple of tablespoons of starter here, and once I feed it, I'll have maybe like a 1/4 cup, and that will be plenty to be able to feed for next time. Now I'm going to start incorporating the salt and the starter by doing a series of stretch and folds, and this is the main way we're going to be quote-unquote kneading our bread. It's not really kneading, you kind of just like stretch the sides and bring it into the center. And this first time it's going to be a little bit more of a longer process because we have to get that starter and that salt in there. But after this, it's going to be a very easy like 30-second process that you have to do every half an hour. And this series of stretch and folds is going to develop the gluten in our bread. After the salt and starter are mostly incorporated, it doesn't have to be 100% since we are going to continue stretching and folding this throughout the day. I'm just going to cover this and leave it again on the counter for 30 to 45 minutes. And from here on out, I'm going to come back to this every 30 to 45 minutes and do another series of stretching and folding. You're going to do this over a period of 4 to 5 hours, so it's going to be a total of anywhere from 6 to 8 stretch and folds, and I'll show you later on what it should look like ideally. You'll notice, especially in the beginning, as you are stretching and folding, The dough will really try and fight you. It is pretty tough, and then as you go on throughout the day, it's going to get looser and looser. So try and just like go around the dough one full time around, so like 5 stretch and folds. And then when it starts to fight you, you can just cover it back up, let it rest. As you let it rest for 40 minutes, that gluten is going to relax. And when you come back to it, you'll notice that it is much stretchier again and you're able to manipulate it a little bit better. And then by the time you get to the end of your stretch and fold, again, it's going to be a little bit tough. So you're just gonna keep letting it relax, coming back and stretching it, letting it relax, coming back and stretching it. And this is going to develop a really nice gluten structure for your bread later on. It really is not a lot of work to do this stretching and folding, but it does require just a little bit of babysitting since you're coming back like every half hour or so. But really don't stress about it if you miss a couple of stretch and folds. I've definitely forgotten a few. If you only do it like once every hour, it's still going to be okay. The structure of your bread might not be as good as if you had done it every half hour. But if you just need to go out and like run an errand, or you just forget about it for a little bit and then you skip a stretch and fold, don't stress out about it. It will still be fine. Around the 5th or 6th stretch and folds, you should really start to see a considerable difference in the texture of your dough. It's much more elastic, and now I'm able to stretch it and fold it a lot further than I was at the beginning of this process. And around this time, you can start testing it using the window pane process to see if the gluten structure is properly developed. And the window pane test is basically just stretching out a little piece of your dough and seeing if it breaks, or if you're able to stretch it into a really thin layer, thin enough that you're able to see light through it, kind of like a window pane. So here I am doing the window pane test, but I can see that my dough did not pass yet. It broke before I was able to make that really thin layer. So I just continued with my stretch and folds, and then I came back to it half an hour later, and then I performed the test again. And this time you can see I am able to stretch it and I'm able to see light through it. So I know that my dough is done with the stretching and folding at this point, finally. So this is going to be my very last one, and then after this, I'm going to cover my dough and let it sit and do its bulk rise. The bulk rise is like the easiest part of the process. You basically just let it sit for anywhere from like 6 to 8 hours. I like to do this room temperature, and that will take me about 6 hours. But if you want to do this overnight, you can stick it in the fridge and do the rest of this process the next day. This part is really flexible, so you can just do whatever works with your schedule. I came back to my dough after 5 hours. It definitely could have used a little bit more time during this part, but it was getting kind of late and I wanted to get this done. You can see that the dough has puffed up a little bit. It doesn't necessarily have to double in size, but you want it to grow at least a little bit to see that there's something alive in there. I'm going to very lightly flour my surface. You don't want to go too crazy on the flour because a little bit of stickiness is actually helpful in the next part of this shaping process. And I'm going to gently dump out my dough onto my surface. I'm not trying to punch it down or anything because it might have some like nice bubbles in there from the bulk rise that I don't want to completely pop. So I'll just lay it in there, and again, since I'm making 2 loaves, I'm going to split this dough into 2 pieces to pre-shape 2 separate loaves. This batch of my dough was a little bit dense. To be honest, I probably could have used with a splash more water in the very beginning of the process. And also, if you let it rise longer during the bulk rise, it might be a little bit looser as well. But honestly, once you get to this point, if you start with a really nice healthy starter and you go through your stretching and folding, sourdough I find is pretty forgivable. So I find that even if I kind of fudge the measurements a little bit, a lot of times I end up with really good sourdough bread anyway. Here I am doing the first shaping process for the loaves. Hopefully you saw how I did that first one while I was talking, but I'll kind of explain the next one as I do it. You pull the top end to the middle, then you pull the bottom to the middle, then the 2 sides. Then you kind of roll it over and just try and tuck all those edges underneath as best as you can. This is just the pre-shaping, so we're going to do this one more time. For now, we're going to cover this and let it sit for 30 minutes and let it relax once more. Here we are almost at the end. Half an hour later, we're going to be doing our final shaping and proofing now. For this, you're going to need either a proofing basket that is made for sourdough. This is called a banneton. I only have one of these, so I am going to be using this for one of the loaves, and you can use it with a liner or without. But if you don't have one of these, it's totally fine. You can just use a normal bowl. Try and find one that has a nice rounded shape that can support your loaf as it rises. You don't want anything that's too big because you do want it to be able to grow up the sides of the bowl a little bit. Colanders are usually a really good shape for this if you don't have a bowl that's the right shape. And then I like to line it with a clean dish towel, and then I'll dust the inside with rice flour. Rice flour is a game changer when I learned about this for sourdough, because the first like 8 or 10 loaves of sourdough that I made, every single one would stick to the bowl when I tried to flip it out. When I would go to bake it, and it was really frustrating because I went through this whole like full day process and then it would stick and then my dough wouldn't rise because the structure was totally compromised. The rice flour is amazing because it doesn't stick to your dough the same way that regular flour does, and it doesn't develop gluten, so it makes almost like a non-stick coating between your dough and the basket, and it makes it super easy to flip out when you're ready to bake it. Now I'm going to do the final shaping, which is exactly like the pre-shaping. You're doing the same series of like stretching the tops and bottoms and then the two sides and then flipping it over. And now we're going to do an extra step of all of this like pulling and tucking. This is a common motion if you make a lot of bread, but what you do is kind of use the stickiness of the dough to your advantage. It's going to try and stick to your work surface a little bit, and as you pull it towards you, you kind of tuck the opposite ends underneath. The goal is to make a really nice, taut, smooth surface to your dough and create a lot of surface tension. This is going to allow it to rise really nicely in the oven. If it's just like all loosey-goosey, then it's just going to be flat when you go to bake it and it's not going to have a nice structure. When I'm happy with my tucking and I think that the surface is really nice, I like to give it a few rotations just to kind of like combine all of those seams that are at the bottom, and then I'm going to sprinkle some rice flour on top and smooth it all over to prevent any stickage, and then I'm going to turn it out into my proofing bowl. Smooth side down, so you want those rough edges facing towards the top, because when we flip it out the next day, this is going to be the bottom of the loaf. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the other loaf, shaping it and then doing a series of pulling and tucking to get that surface as smooth as possible. If you want, you can also add some toppings before you add the rice flour on top. So you can just roll this into some sesame seeds or poppy seeds. Everything but the bagel seasoning is also one that I used to do a lot. Today I'm just going to be making some simple plain loaves, so I'm going to be skipping that step. These are going to proof at least overnight. You can go up to even like 2 days if you want to. The longer it sits, the more sour it's going to be because it's going to continue fermenting. And if you're going to leave it for 2 days, definitely put it in the fridge to slow down that process. I like to leave it out on the counter overnight so that I could bake it the next morning, and then I am done with this whole process within 24 hours. The next day, first thing in the morning, I'm going to load up my oven with 2 Dutch ovens and preheat my oven to 500 degrees. And you're gonna put those in the oven to preheat with the oven for at least half an hour to get those Dutch ovens ripping hot. After half an hour, I'm going to prepare my loaves. I like to use parchment paper because I'm terrified of burning myself on a 500-degree Dutch oven. This parchment paper is going to make like a nice little hammock for your bread so that you can really easily lower it into your Dutch oven. So you just have to place the piece of parchment paper over your bowl, flip the whole thing over, and then I can take the bowl off and peel off my towel, and I have this beautiful, perfect domed loaf. And I'm gonna do this with both of these since I'm baking them both at the same time. If you don't have two Dutch ovens, you just have one, that's fine. I actually only just got my second one recently, and I used to just bake my loaves back to back, and you can totally do that. Just let your Dutch oven preheat with the lid for 5 minutes in between the loaves if you're gonna do this back to back. After I have these flipped over onto some parchment, you're going to need to make some slashes along the top of the dough. This is going to give it an area for it to expand and for steam to escape as it rises. If you don't slash this, then it's kind of just going to explode and make some kind of crater in whatever place it wants. But this way you can control where it's going to lift, and then you can also just make it really pretty and make some decorative slashes as well. There are special tools that you can use for this, but I just use a simple razor blade. For your main slash, you want to try and do it all in one go and get it pretty deep. If you just do it on the surface, it's not actually going to expand correctly. So try and get it like a good 1/4 inch into the dough. Now that everything's been preheating for half an hour, first you're going to remove your Dutch oven, and it's helpful to have a partner to do this if you have one. And remove the lid, place your loaf in there in its little parchment hammock, and then place the lid on right away and put it back into the oven. Putting the lid onto the Dutch oven is going to trap in a lot of the steam that the dough is going to release as that water inside the dough evaporates. And it's going to cause what's known as oven spring, which is when your dough rises within the Dutch oven and creates a really beautiful rise. So here we are after 15 minutes of baking with the lids on, and you can see that beautiful oven spring. The doughs have risen so beautifully, and now we just have to continue baking for 7 to 12 minutes to develop that crust and get that nice golden color on top. And then after that, the loaves are done baking exactly 24 hours from when we first started this process. They look absolutely beautiful. That crust is a beautiful golden color, and you can see how the bread has risen, especially where we slash the dough to control that rise, and they both have a really nice oven spring. I like to immediately place my bread onto some wire cooling racks. That way, the beautiful crispy crust doesn't get soggy sitting in the Dutch oven. And then one of the hardest parts, I know it's going to smell amazing at this point, but you have to wait for these to completely cool down before you slice into it. If you slice too early, you're going to ruin the texture inside, and it's going to be really gummy. So let it sit there for at least half an hour, ideally like 45 minutes to an hour. But one thing I like to do, since I am the baker and I worked so hard for this bread, I like to sneak a little part of the top where it's crispiest. This is usually the best part, and I just break off a little piece as a little chef's treat. You guys can probably hear as I eat this how crazy crunchy this is. That really crispy crust is probably one of the best parts of homemade sourdough. My loaves are completely cool now, so let's cut into them and see what the texture looks like on the inside. So here we are, you can see from the cross section that beautiful domed shape, which means that we got a really good rise. We have slightly irregular bubbles, but nothing like too crazy. I actually don't like when sourdough has really big bubbles, because then when you go to slice it and say you're making like a sandwich or something, there's a giant hole in your slice of bread. So this is the perfect texture for me. You can see that the dough is a little bit bouncy when you press on it, but not tacky. And it definitely took me a little bit of practice to get my sourdough to look like this. But I think that once you get the hang of it, it is a very simple process and it's very adaptable. You can play with different flours and you can kind of just like change up the timing to get a more developed flavor or a less developed flavor. You can play with the decoration on top, and there is just so much you can do, and it's a really fun thing to know how to do, to be able to make bread with just flour and water essentially. You don't ever have to depend on having any yeast in your house. And once you learn this process, I'm sure you're going to have sourdough in your house all the time, just like we do. I hope that this helped kind of simplify the process of sourdough, because when I was first doing research into it, it was really confusing and it seemed overly complicated, and I hope that this video made that process a little bit more approachable for you. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.